Sarah Mitchell looked like any other middle-aged math teacher applying for the civilian pilot training program. Colonel Harrison saw an easy target when he ordered her to strip off her uniform in front of everyone. He had no idea he was humiliating Ghost, the legendary fighter pilot who would return the next morning in a French Rafale to settle an old score. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the chain-link fences of Nellis Air Force Base, where the civilian pilot training program conducted its intensive 8-week courses. Heat waves shimmered off the tarmac as F-16 Fighting Falcons roared overhead, their afterburners painting contrails against the cloudless sky. Inside the sterile briefing room of Building 47, fluorescent lights hummed overhead while the smell of strong coffee mixed with the lingering scent of jet fuel that seemed to permeate every military installation. Maps covered the walls, showing flight patterns and restricted airspace, while motivational posters featuring sleek fighter jets reminded everyone of the program's ultimate goal. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in the back row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as she observed the other participants in the civilian pilot training program. At 42, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend seamlessly into any suburban setting. Shoulder-length brown hair streaked with early gray, reading glasses perched on her nose, and the soft build of someone who spent more time grading papers than running obstacle courses. For the past 10 years, she had been exactly what she appeared to be, a high school mathematics teacher in a small Nevada town, beloved by her students for her patience and respected by her colleagues for her dedication. Her modest apartment was filled with algebra textbooks and student projects, her weekends spent tutoring struggling students or hiking alone in the desert mountains. She drove a reliable Honda Civic, shopped at the local grocery store, and lived the kind of quiet, predictable life that drew no attention from anyone. But beneath this carefully constructed normalcy lay a past that Sarah had buried so deeply that sometimes she almost believed it had happened to someone else. The calluses on her hands came not from grading papers, but from years of gripping fighter jet controls. The way she unconsciously scanned the sky whenever she heard aircraft engines overhead was a habit formed in combat zones where situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. The decision to apply for the civilian pilot training program had been impulsive, driven by a restlessness that 10 years of teaching hadn't been able to quiet. Sarah told herself she was simply exploring a childhood dream, pursuing the kind of flying opportunity that most civilians never experienced. But deep down, she knew the truth was more complicated. The program was run by Colonel Marcus Harrison, the same man whose betrayal had destroyed her military career and cost her brother his life. Whether she was seeking closure justice or simply the chance to fly again, Sarah couldn't say. She only knew that some wounds never fully healed and some debts could never be forgotten. The application process for the civilian pilot training program had been surprisingly straightforward. Sarah's teaching credentials and clean background check easily qualified her for the security clearance required to train on military aircraft. Her civilian pilot's license, maintained through weekend flights in rented Cessnas, demonstrated basic competency. What the application didn't reveal was the thousands of hours she'd logged in F-16s, F-22s, and experimental aircraft that most pilots could only dream of flying. When the acceptance letter arrived, Sarah stared at it for a long time before making her decision. she could continue her quiet life as a teacher, safe in her anonymity and free from the painful memories that military service would inevitably trigger. Or she could return to the world that had once defined her, knowing that she would likely encounter the man who had destroyed everything she'd once held dear. The deciding factor wasn't revenge or justice. It was the realization that she had been running for 10 years, and running had solved nothing. Her brother David's death still haunted her dreams. The injustice of her forced resignation still burned in her chest. The waste of her skills and experience still felt like a betrayal of everything she'd once believed about honor and service. If she was ever going to find peace, she needed to face her past directly. Sarah's approach to the training program was methodical and deliberately unremarkable. She arrived early, stayed late, and performed competently without drawing attention to her superior skills. During ground school, she asked basic questions about aircraft systems she could have taught herself. In the simulator, she made the kinds of minor mistakes that civilian pilots typically made while learning military procedures. Her strategy was simple: observe, learn, and wait for the right moment to reveal herself. She needed to understand the current dynamics of the program, identify potential allies among the staff, and most importantly, gather evidence of Colonel Harrison's ongoing misconduct. Sarah had learned from bitter experience that accusations without proof were worthless, especially when made against a decorated officer with powerful connections. She began documenting everything: Harrison's treatment of other participants, his deviation from established training protocols, and the subtle signs of the same corruption that had destroyed her career a decade earlier. Sarah carried a small digital recorder in her pocket, took careful notes after each interaction, and began building the case that would either vindicate her or destroy what remained of her reputation. The stakes couldn't have been higher, but Sarah had already lost everything once. This time, she was prepared to fight back. The first confrontation came during week 3 of the program, when Colonel Harrison was reviewing flight performance records with the entire class. Sarah had been deliberately flying at about 70% of her capability, good enough to avoid remedial training, but not so good as to attract unwanted attention. She thought her performance had been perfectly calibrated to appear competent, but unremarkable. "Mitchell!" Harrison called out, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that military officers used when they wanted to humiliate someone publicly. "Your performance in the T-6 has been adequate, barely. Tell me what makes you think you have what it takes to fly military aircraft." Sarah looked up from her notes, meeting Harrison's gaze directly for the first time since the program began. For just a moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not recognition exactly, but a sense that something about her was familiar. Then the moment passed, and his expression returned to its usual condescending sneer. "I'm here to learn, sir," Sarah replied quietly. "I understand that military flying requires different skills than civilian aviation, and I'm committed to meeting whatever standards you set." Harrison's smile was cold. "We'll see about that, won't we? Some people just aren't cut out for this kind of work." As the weeks progressed, Harrison's treatment of Sarah became increasingly hostile and personal. During flight briefings, he would single her out for criticism that seemed disproportionate to any mistakes she might have made. He questioned her motivation for joining the program, suggested that her age made her unsuitable for military aviation, and made pointed comments about civilians who think they understand what real flying means. The other participants began to notice the pattern of harassment, but none were willing to speak up against a full colonel. Sarah endured it all with the same quiet dignity she brought to dealing with difficult students, but she was carefully documenting every incident. Her digital recorder captured Harrison's most egregious comments, while her detailed notes provided context and corroboration for what was clearly a pattern of discriminatory behavior. During one particularly brutal critique session, Harrison announced that Sarah's performance was an embarrassment to this program and an insult to the taxpayers funding it. He suggested that she consider withdrawing voluntarily rather than being dismissed for incompetence. Sarah simply nodded and said she would continue working to improve her performance. But that night, she made a phone call to a contact at the Pentagon, someone who remembered Ghost and owed her a favor. Word of Harrison's behavior began to reach higher levels of command through unofficial channels. Sarah's contact at the Pentagon, Major General Patricia Chen, had served as a young captain under Sarah's command during Operation Desert Storm. Chen remembered Ghost as one of the most skilled and honorable officers she'd ever known, and she was disturbed to learn about the harassment Sarah was experiencing. General Chen began making discreet inquiries about the civilian pilot training program and Colonel Harrison's management of it. What she discovered was troubling a pattern of favoritism misconduct and the same kind of corruption that had led to the cover-up of David Mitchell's death 10 years earlier. Harrison had been using his position to advance the careers of officers who supported him while destroying those who questioned his methods. Meanwhile, other participants in the training program began to see Sarah differently. Her calm response to Harrison's abuse, combined with occasional glimpses of knowledge that seemed beyond her supposed experience level, made some of them wonder about her background. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the program's instructor pilots, noticed that Sarah's stick and rudder skills were far superior to what her performance records indicated. She flew with a kind of instinctive precision that took years to develop, yet she claimed to have only civilian experience. The breakthrough came during a challenging weather training flight when another participant, a young former Navy pilot named Thompson, experienced spatial disorientation in heavy clouds and nearly lost control of his T-6 trainer. The instructor pilot was preparing to take control when Sarah's voice came calmly over the radio, providing Thompson with precise guidance that helped him recover from the potentially fatal situation. Her instructions were textbook perfect, delivered with the kind of authority that came from extensive experience with emergency situations. More importantly, she had diagnosed Thompson's problem and provided the correct solution faster than the instructor pilot, demonstrating a level of situational awareness that civilian pilots simply didn't possess. After the flight, Thompson approached Sarah privately to thank her for potentially saving his life. "Where did you learn to think that fast in an emergency?" he asked. "That wasn't civilian flying, that was combat pilot stuff." Sarah looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Sometimes people have more experience than their records show," she said quietly. "The important thing is that you're safe." But Thompson wasn't satisfied with that answer, and he began asking questions among the other participants. Sarah's cover was beginning to slip, and she knew that the final confrontation with Harrison was approaching rapidly. Harrison seemed to sense that his authority over Sarah was slipping, and his harassment intensified accordingly. He began scheduling her for additional flights, hoping to catch her in mistakes that would justify her dismissal from the program. He assigned her the most difficult training scenarios and criticized her performance even when it was clearly superior to other participants. The breaking point came during week 7 of the program, when Harrison announced that there would be a formal review of all participants' progress. Those who didn't meet standards would be dismissed immediately, losing their chance to complete the program and receive their military pilot certification. Sarah knew that Harrison intended to use this review to eliminate her from the program regardless of her actual performance. That evening, Sarah made a series of phone calls to contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. She reached out to former squadron mates, superior officers who had respected her abilities, and military contractors who remembered Ghost's legendary skills. She was calling in favors activating networks that had been dormant for a decade and preparing for a confrontation that would either restore her reputation or destroy her completely. The time for hiding was over. Ghost was about to return. The formal review session was scheduled for a Friday morning in the main briefing room with all participants, instructors, and senior staff in attendance. Sarah arrived early and took her usual seat in the back row, but she could sense that something was different. Harrison's demeanor was more aggressive than usual, and there was an anticipatory tension among the staff that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine performance review. Harrison began the session by announcing that the program had identified several participants who were not meeting the standards required for military aviation. Flying military aircraft is not a game, he declared, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Sarah. It requires dedication, skill, and most importantly, the right kind of character. Some people simply don't belong in this environment. He called several participants forward to discuss their performance, offering constructive criticism and additional training opportunities. But when he called Sarah's name, his tone changed completely. "Mitchell, front and center, we need to have a serious discussion about your future in this program." Sarah walked to the front of the room with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the program. She could feel every eye in the room watching her, sensing that this moment was somehow different from the routine critiques they had witnessed before. Harrison's smile was predatory as he opened her file and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. "Your performance has been consistently substandard," he announced. "Your attitude suggests a lack of respect for military authority, and your presence in this program is frankly an insult to the real pilots who have earned their place here." What happened next shocked everyone in the room. Harrison closed Sarah's file and looked directly at her with undisguised contempt. "I don't know what made you think you belonged here, but it's time to face reality. You're not pilot material, and you never will be." Then he delivered the blow that crossed every line of professional conduct and human decency. "Remove your flight suit, Mitchell, right now in front of everyone. You don't deserve to wear it, and I want everyone here to see exactly what happens to people who waste our time with their delusions of adequacy." The room fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning. Several participants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal military discipline. Even the instructors looked uncomfortable, but none were willing to challenge a full colonel's authority. Sarah stood perfectly still for a moment, her face showing no emotion as she processed what Harrison had just demanded. Then, without a word, she began removing her flight suit. She unzipped it slowly, methodically, maintaining eye contact with Harrison as she stripped down to her t-shirt and pants. The humiliation was intended to be complete and public, a demonstration of Harrison's power and Sarah's helplessness. But as Sarah folded her flight suit and placed it on the table in front of Harrison, something in her posture changed. The submissive civilian pilot disappeared, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made several people in the room straighten unconsciously. "You're right, Colonel," she said quietly. "I don't belong here. This uniform deserves better than to be worn in the presence of a corrupt officer who betrayed his oath and got good people killed." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Harrison's face went white, then red with rage. "How dare you?" he began, but Sarah was already walking toward the door. As Sarah reached the door, she turned back to face the room one final time. Her humiliation was complete, her dismissal from the program inevitable, but there was something in her expression that made Harrison take an unconscious step backward. "You want to know who I really am?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "You want to know why I'm really here tomorrow morning? Look up. The truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when it comes from 30,000 feet." She walked out of the briefing room without another word, leaving behind a stunned silence and a room full of people trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Harrison tried to regain control of the situation, dismissing the incident and continuing with the review. But the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. Several participants were staring at the door Sarah had just walked through, while others were looking at Harrison with new understanding of what kind of man he really was. That evening, Sarah made one final phone call. "This is Ghost," she said when the call was answered. "I need that favor we discussed. Tomorrow morning, Nellis Air Force Base. It's time to settle an old debt." That night, Sarah drove to a small private airfield 30 miles outside Las Vegas, where a sleek business jet waited on the tarmac. The pilot who greeted her was Captain Marie Dubois of the French Air Force, a woman Sarah had trained with during a NATO exchange program 15 years earlier. Dubois had risen to become one of France's most respected test pilots, and she owed her career to lessons Sarah had taught her about combat flying. "Ghost," Dubois said with a smile, using the call sign that had once struck fear into enemy pilots across 3 continents. "It has been too long. When you called and asked for this favor, I could not refuse. The Rafale is fueled and ready, the most advanced fighter jet in the French inventory." Sarah spent the next hour familiarizing herself with the Rafale systems, though her hands seemed to remember the controls instinctively. The French fighter was more advanced than anything she had flown during her active duty years, but the fundamentals remained the same. More importantly, it was capable of maneuvers that would demonstrate her true abilities in ways that no amount of testimony could match. As dawn approached, Sarah suited up in the flight gear Dubois had provided, complete with French Air Force insignia that would make her identity unmistakable to anyone watching from the ground. Standing beside the Rafale in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah experienced a moment of uncertainty that surprised her. For 10 years, she had built a life based on anonymity and quiet service. She had found peace in teaching purpose, in helping young minds discover the beauty of mathematics, and satisfaction in a simple existence that demanded nothing more than competence and compassion. What she was about to do would destroy that life forever. There would be no returning to her classroom, no more quiet evenings grading papers, no more peaceful weekends hiking in the desert. She would become Ghost again, with all the complications and expectations that identity carried. But then she thought of her brother David killed because of Harrison's cowardice and corruption. She thought of the other pilots who had died because Harrison had prioritized his career over their safety. Some debts, Sarah realized, were more important than personal peace. Some truths demanded to be revealed regardless of the cost. At precisely over 800 hours, as the morning briefing session was beginning at Nellis Air Force Base, the Rafale appeared on the horizon like a silver arrow against the blue Nevada sky. Sarah had timed her approach perfectly, arriving just as Harrison would be addressing the participants about the previous day's unfortunate incident and explaining why some people simply weren't suited for military aviation. The distinctive sound of the Rafale's twin engines reached the briefing room first, causing several participants to look up with curiosity. Military aircraft flew over Nellis constantly, but this sound was different, more aggressive, more purposeful. Through the windows, they could see the French fighter approaching at low altitude, its sleek profile unmistakable against the desert landscape. Harrison continued his briefing, apparently oblivious to the approaching aircraft, but his voice was beginning to compete with the growing roar of jet engines. Several participants were now openly staring out the windows, recognizing that something unusual was happening. As the Rafale passed over the briefing room at barely 500 feet, the building shook from the sonic pressure of its passage. Harrison stopped mid-sentence, his face flushing with anger at the interruption. "What the hell is that pilot doing?" he demanded, but his question was answered almost immediately as the fighter began a series of maneuvers that no routine training flight would ever attempt. The Rafale climbed vertically, seeming to hang motionless in the sky for a moment before rolling into a perfect barrel roll. Then it dove toward the ground, pulling up at the last possible second in a maneuver that required split-second timing and absolute confidence in both the aircraft and the pilot's abilities. The participants pressed against the windows, watching in awe as the French fighter performed maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of both physics and human endurance. But this was just the beginning.
Sarah was demonstrating skills that went far beyond routine aerobatics, executing combat maneuvers that most of the observers had only read about in tactical manuals. The climax of the aerial display came when the Rafale performed a maneuver that was theoretically possible but practically suicidal, a vertical climb followed by a controlled flat spin that brought the aircraft to a complete stop in midair before recovering into normal flight. It was a maneuver that Sarah had pioneered during her active duty years one that had earned her the call sign Ghost because she seemed to make her aircraft disappear and reappear at will. As the Rafale completed this impossible maneuver, Harrison's face went from red to white. He recognized the technique, remembered where he had seen it before, and suddenly understood exactly who was flying that French fighter jet. The woman he had humiliated the day before wasn't just some civilian pilot with delusions of adequacy. She was the legendary Ghost, the pilot whose innovations had revolutionized air combat tactics. The other participants were beginning to understand as well. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had noticed Sarah's superior flying skills during training, was the first to make the connection. "That's not just any pilot," he said quietly. "That's someone with serious combat experience. That's someone who's been holding back during our training flights." Thompson, the pilot Sarah had helped during the weather emergency, stared at the Rafale with growing comprehension. "Mitchell," he whispered. "That's Sarah Mitchell up there." The final element of Sarah's demonstration was a low-level pass directly over the briefing room, slow enough for everyone to see the French Air Force markings and the pilot's helmet clearly visible in the cockpit. As the Rafale passed overhead, Sarah waggled the wings in a gesture that was both greeting and challenge, a message that could not be misunderstood. Then her voice came over the base's emergency radio frequency broadcast to every receiver on Nellis Air Force Base. "This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign, Ghost United States Air Force. 10 years ago, Colonel Harrison's corruption and cowardice led to the death of my brother and the cover-up of multiple safety violations. The evidence has been forwarded to the Inspector General of the Pentagon and the media. Justice delayed is not justice denied." The Rafale climbed away from the base, disappearing into the morning sky as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a briefing room full of stunned participants and one very frightened colonel who finally understood that his past had caught up with him. The silence in the briefing room lasted exactly 30 seconds before chaos erupted. Participants were talking over each other, trying to process what they had just witnessed, while Harrison stood frozen at the front of the room, his face a mask of shock and growing terror. The phone in the briefing room began ringing immediately, base security, air traffic control, and the commanding general's office, all demanding explanations for the unauthorized flyover. Within an hour, military police arrived to escort Harrison to the base commander's office, where investigators from the Inspector General's office were already waiting with boxes of evidence that Sarah had spent months collecting. The corruption that had been hidden for a decade was finally exposed, complete with documentation recordings and testimony from witnesses who had been afraid to speak up until Ghost's dramatic return gave them the courage to tell the truth. The other participants in the civilian pilot training program found themselves at the center of a media storm as news of Ghost's return spread throughout the military community. Harrison's court-martial became one of the most publicized military justice cases in recent memory, with Sarah's aerial demonstration serving as the dramatic opening that captured public attention and ensured that the truth could not be buried again. The evidence she had gathered led to multiple convictions, policy changes, and a complete overhaul of oversight procedures for military training programs. Sarah's vindication was complete, but it came at the cost of her anonymity and peaceful life. She was offered reinstatement to active duty with full honors, promotion, opportunities, and command positions that recognized her exceptional abilities. Military contractors offered lucrative consulting positions, and aerospace companies wanted to hire the legendary pilot who had demonstrated skills that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The civilian pilot training program was suspended pending investigation, with several participants receiving transfers to other programs where they could complete their training under proper supervision. Many of them spoke publicly about Sarah's character and the quiet dignity with which she had endured months of harassment. But Sarah Mitchell chose a different path. She declined all offers of reinstatement, promotion, and employment in the aviation industry. Instead, she returned to her small Nevada town and her job as a high school mathematics teacher, where she found that her students looked at her with new respect and wonder. "Why did you come back to teaching?" one student asked. "You could be flying jets anywhere in the world." Sarah smiled as she wrote an equation on the whiteboard. "Because this is where I can make the biggest difference. Some battles are fought in the sky, but the most important ones are fought in classrooms, one student at a time."